So excited to have you here for this event with Dr. Dan Siegel. He is coming to us from California, I believe, and we're excited to have him here. He is needs no introduction on so many levels, but we're excited because we're here to talk about social emotional learning with kids. And Dan is a new, as of today, release day author of the Now Maps book series. And so a lot of what we've built for today is based on that and his decades of work. And we're just so excited that the day has come. Dan, thank you so much for being here. And the floor is yours. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you everyone for being here. It's really an honor to be here to celebrate a number of birthdays, the birthdays for Now Maps Jr., and it also happens to be my son, Alex Siegel, the musician you may know of. He's my son, and today's his birthday, so happy birthday to Alex. And I'm excited to be here with all of you and look forward to this conversation. We're at this incredible moment in our human history where we're facing so many challenges. So, whether you're an educator or a parent or a therapist, any of us citizens of the earth, we are facing so much that's going on with the pandemics that affect us. And so, helping children grow is so important. And I'm thrilled that with Dina Margolin, we were able to put together this Now Maps approach. And then you'll see in that book the lessons that come from a field that you may be familiar with called interpersonal neurobiology. And Dina was an associate at our Mindsight Institute, the kind of brick and mortar home for interpersonal neurobiology, where we bring all the different fields of science and other ways of understanding reality together to ask the question, what is the mind? What is mental health? And how can we cultivate well-being and resilience in children and adolescents and even in us as adults to try to help the world be a healthier place? So in the Now Maps books, what you'll see is an approach to really say, what are the science-based understandings of how resilience develops in a child, so that as a child moves through their development into adolescence and then onward into adulthood, they have the aspects of the mind that allow them to be aware of the interior world, which you can use the word interoception for perception of the interior, but also insight for awareness of the mental life that you have within you, but then also develop the skills that allow you to understand others. So, using kind of these mind sight maps, we can call them, of your interior for insight, and a mind sight map of the interior of another person's life, where you feel their feelings or understand what it might be like to be that person, or even take their perspective. Those are three aspects of what's called empathy. And the gateway toward compassion is sometimes called empathic concern, where you feel the suffering of another. So, compassion, where you're feeling the suffering and imagining how to reduce that suffering and taking action, in many ways builds on empathy, which is where we feel the feelings and understand another person's point of view. And all of that can be put under the term mindsight. And so at the Mindsight Institute, we are really interested in developing this insight and empathy and compassion. And so, what I'm going to do with you today is go through some fundamental ways that the human brain, as it grows from the earliest days onward, develops the capacity for these skills that when Dan Goleman, who wrote the book on emotional intelligence and wrote the book Social Intelligence, wrote the foreword to the book I wrote, Mindsight, Dan Goleman said that mindsight, this mechanism of sensing the interior of oneself, of others, and building this process called integration, mindsight is the basis for social and emotional learning. So we want to take that apart so that as you, in whatever you're doing with children, a parent, an educator, a therapist, can use the tools of the Now Maps approach, whether it's Now Maps for tweens, or now maps for preschool age, for the straight now maps junior book, which takes you on stories. What we can see is how you actually understand how the mind is not the same as the brain, but the mind can be used to actually grow the brain in certain ways that promote well-being. So let me begin by just starting with a simple statement. When you think about what the mind is, and I'm just aware of a hair that's in my glasses. Thank you for your patience. When you think about what the mind is, what I'd like to ask you about, and let's see if we can do well, we have so many people, it might be hard to get everybody's response with thousands of people on. But when you think about what the mind is, what comes to your mind? Now, for some people, they'll think, well, I've been told in my education that the mind is what the brain does. And that very common statement, of course, keeps the mind restricted up to the brain and the head. But what a long line of reasoning and the many different books I've written, including the textbook, The Developing Mind, in its third edition now, uh, sh- tries to demonstrate is that the word mind involves at least four facets. And those include subjective experience, which is the sensation of being alive, which right away means that the word mind is not the same as brain activity, even if it were to only be related to brain activity, which I'll show you is probably not true. But the mind, as having number one, subjective experience, means that when a child is growing and you tune into their mind, it means you're sensing their subjective experience. We call that attunement. And in terms of the first aspect of the mind, naming subjective experience allows you as a teacher, for example, to make sure you focus on subjective experience inside the child, that you honor that as a fundamental aspect of mind. But a second facet of mind, also that builds social and emotional intelligence, is not just respecting that subjective experience is real and really important, but number two is you have consciousness. So consciousness, which includes both the thing you're aware of, like if I say hello, you have the sound hello, or my hands moving, you can see them and I say hello, and you have the awareness that I said hello. So you can see that consciousness includes both the knowns, the hello, and the knowing, the awareness. And what this does is it lets us see that we have this amazing thing that falls under the word mind, that you can work with children so that they can develop their awareness in ways we'll talk about in a moment, to be more aware of subjective sensations inside of themselves and in others. So you can see, even just with these two facets, we begin to look at how you build these mind sight capacities to sense one's inner subjective sense of the mind, which is your subjective experience, and that of another person, moves us away from thinking it's just brain activity, and also allows us to see what you might do in your parenting, or in the way that you are teaching, or the way you're conducting therapy. Now, a third aspect of mind has to do with something called information processing. So if I say something like, uh, you know, a rose bush, now saying rose bush might be different from saying, a pine tree, right? Now, when you think about a pine tree and a rose bush, they both comprise two words: pine tree, maybe it's one word, rose bush, but they mean different things. And yet, they're both sound waves, right? Pine tree, rose bush. But the meaning of the energy flow, in this case, sound, is different. And when energy flow is in a certain formation that symbolizes something, we call that formation information. So you can see clearly here that Information is a pattern of energy with symbolic value, and the mind not only allows energy to flow through it with subjective experience like a hose, kind of like a conduit, but it's also a constructor. So it constructs symbolic meaning. Now, as a teacher, of course, you do this all the time, trying to build the capacity of a child to construct information in useful ways, to remember things, to know skills. But what we're seeing here is that by identifying we have the constructive process of mind and a conduit process, you can actually make sure that you as a teacher or you as a therapist or you as a parent help your child as they go realize that they have this experience of the flow of sensation coming through them and they have the ability to construct information. And when they start realizing that, suddenly you start to have this capacity to sense that a thought, for example, is a constructed piece of energy flow. And instead of taking it as the totality of reality, you develop this capacity to have more objectivity, even about the nature of mental processing, like information processing. So now those three facets are common descriptions of the mind. Where we're going to go next is looking at a fourth facet of mind. And I'm just going to give you like a 1 minute summary of where this comes from so everyone can be on the same page about it. If you've been in our courses at the Mindsight Institute, you spent hours and hours talking about what I'm about to say in 1 minute. If you've read any of the books, you know this too, but let's just summarize it. That when you see the mind as having subjective experience, consciousness, and information processing, and you say, well, what is this mind made of? And you see, we've already brought up the word energy flow. If you think about the system of mind and realize that it's both relational, that is, it's happening now between me and you, something in the betweenness, and it's also happening inside your body, so the withinness. What could a system be of mind that was both fully embodied, not just up in the head? So your subjective sensation, for example, can be in your heart, in your abdomen. It can be in your muscles. You have subjective sensations that are a part of what goes on in the head brain, but not limited to the head. And then, just as is happening right now between me and you, this energy is shared between you and me. And so, as we do this, and I can even look at the chat, and if you were to write things in, I can see there questions that are coming in. If you have questions, you can bring them in and we'll get some questions soon. But you can see you're getting all sorts of wonderful, uh, you know, remarks here about what to do. So I can be communicating with you that way, getting information processing from you. But that system has qualities that make it what's called a complex system. It's capable of being chaotic. It's open. It's what's called nonlinear, meaning a small input can lead to large and um, somewhat predictable, unpredictable outcomes. So when something is chaos capable, open, and nonlinear like that, we call it a complex system. And complex systems have emergent properties, something that arises from the interaction of the elements of the system that's greater than the elements themselves. That's called emergence, kind of synergy. And when the synergy of energy flow happens, what the proposal is that it might lead to these first three. Of course, information processing we've seen as an aspect of energy flow, but consciousness and subjective experience might also be considered emergent properties. But here's one of the emergent properties that gets us deep into what now maps is about. This fourth facet of the mind is called self-organization in a mathematical point of view, and the notion that the mind is a self-organizing emergent and embodied relational process um, tells us that as a process that's regulating the flow of energy information, anything that regulates, like when you regulate a bicycle, involves both monitoring something and modifying something. So you're sensing it, you're shaping it, you're tracking it, you're transforming it. Those two things, monitoring and modifying, what that means is that you can teach a child in school to monitor what? To monitor energy flow where? Within the body, including the head brain, and within relationships, including the individuals that they're interacting with. So this changes the entire notion of how you would conduct education. And in Now Maps, what we do is we teach a child themselves how to learn to monitor what's going on now. That's the idea of mapping now. And then using a number of things. One, we have a pause button. So we have these images of basically how to take the fourth facet of mind, self organization, see it as a regulatory process, know that regulation involves monitoring and modifying, and that literally, when you look at the circuits in the head brain that are connected to the body proper and that are connected to the social world, you begin to realize that when you build a mind site map making capacity, you're taking these, what Dina Margolin and I have named Now Maps, which are basically mind site maps, to use that phrase. These mind site maps allow you in the present moment to say, what is my subjective experience? What am I aware of? What information am I constructing out of this energy flow? Not in these, sophisticated ways of saying it, but for a kid, it's basically saying what's happening now. And the happening is identified as having a spatial place inside or outside. What's happening inside this body? What's happening between you and me in our relationship? What's happening inside of you? So when you think about social and emotional intelligence, what this mind site map making ability does, these now maps, is it says to a kid, number one, I have a superpower. And that superpower is the ability to pause before I act. Now, in the brain, you take your thumb, put your thumb in the middle, put your hand over the top, and look at this hand model of the brain. What it says is that you have these prefrontal circuits right behind your forehead that are capable of taking input from the cortex itself, receiving input from the lower areas. In books I've written with Tina Payne Bryson, we talk about this as the downstairs brain. In more formal terms, you would call this the subcortical areas. In older neurological terms, you might have called this the limbic area, but some people are saying it's not really a separate area. So we could call it the previously named limbic area, like Prince, the prior artist named Prince, bless his soul. And then we have the brainstem areas here, limbic and brainstem. But we could just use the word subcortical just to honor neuroscientists saying let's not call it limbic, which is fine. But it's the downstairs brain basically. So when you get input from these more basic areas of the brain that are regulating things like your feeling of threat and the fighting, fleeing, freezing, fainting reactivities that we experience, or the way you regulate your heart or your respiration or your digestion. All that is subcortical. So when you get an impulse on a playground, for example, and someone takes your block, you've got to use your prefrontal cortex here behind your forehead to inhibit the impulse, let's say, to punch someone taking your block, and say, you know, instead use your words, which is what we learn at preschool, and say, that doesn't make me feel good that you've taken my block. That makes me feel mad. That makes me feel sad. You know, give my block back. And then you, instead of punching a kid, you go to the teacher if the child doesn't give you the block back or you can't work out how to play together. What you can talk about in terms of that is the prefrontal region is monitoring the impulse from the lower region, and then it's modifying how that subcortical area will push forward the drive to punch somebody, take over the prefrontal region is very much related in the frontal lobe to the motor strip of the brain and the premotor strip, which plans an action or carries out an action. And so this whole region here is able to pause. And the pause button allows you to reflect and think about what to do. So you not only have the pause button, but you have this way of monitoring and asking yourself, we call it an OK monitor, and asking yourself, what actually is going on right now? I'm pausing. I'm now asking the question, am I okay? Am I about to punch somebody? Am I about to flip out? Am I, going to not be able to behave the way I want to? And in that reflective moment, you're basically creating, this kind of, we call it a now map compass, where you're able to say, what am I feeling in my body? What am I thinking in my mind's thought processes, the train of thought? What do I want to do in terms of my planning action? And in this, this now map compass, what you have essentially is, if you're familiar with the wheel of awareness, you've got this way of looking at on the rim of the wheel all the things that could be going on that now you take from the hub of awareness, that's the knowing, you have now differentiated from the knowns on the rim. And instead of giving the now maps the wheel of awareness, we give them the now map compass. So you have these tools then that allow a child to realize that their experience is happening inside the body. We call it energy flow, basically, right in the book. And as a tween reading the Now Maps book, you actually learn yourself, reading it yourself, how you can develop these superpowers of mindset, basically, and other things that we talk about in great detail in the book, and give the child the opportunity to learn how to be aware of what their mental life is, what's going on inside of them, and the importance of relationships and defining who we are. And in the pandemic, this is incredibly important because we have this opportunity to really see the pandemic, as challenging as it is, and we're still in the pandemic. In case I was at a meeting just a few minutes ago, someone kind of accidentally said, uh, you know, what's been your favorite experience after the pandemic? And then someone said, well, it's more like an intermission. We're still in the pandemic and it's still happening, which is true. In fact, we may have new surges coming up very soon. So, or they're already starting to happen in certain places. So, this moment, we've never needed these mindset skills that Now Maps teaches as much as we have now. So this regulatory capacity, it's not a given. You need to learn to build these skills, and mindsight is it's a potential that needs to be activated. What sometimes happens in schools, at home, is that we don't take the opportunity to realize that if we're really interested in cultivating the mind of the child, and keep in mind that when I say mind, I don't mean intellect versus emotion. That's not what I mean at all. The mind is subjective experience. So anything you feel in your heart is a part of what we're calling mind. Anything you can be aware of within consciousness, that's what we're calling mind. Any way you process information, even about intuitive things, artistic things, things that are relational, we're putting that under the word mind. So let's really keep that in mind, that when we want to develop the mind of the child, we're doing more than just filling that pail, with water, as the saying goes in education. I think it was from Dewey who said this. We're trying to actually ignite a fire. We're trying to keep the fire of curiosity alive, so that when you teach these mindset skills, it really allows a child to develop the curiosity and excitement, the fundamental ways where they then carry their mind around with them. Now, in the pandemic, the viral pandemic, we can see that having social connection, even with what I think we should rename as physical distancing at times, not social distancing, call it physical distancing, you can maintain, especially in this digital age, ways that we connect with each other. So I want to talk about those connections now, and really look at how in Now Maps, what we try to do is provide the fundamental skills of connection internally. So I'm using my mindsight ability to make a mindset map of what's happening now inside this body called me. But I'm also making a mindsight map of what's happening inside of you for empathy. And for our relational we, I make a mindsight map of us, of we. So in a way, these are like three maps that the now maps capacity allows you to say, I'm mapping what's happening now. And it's all in the word mind because it's the subjective experience we're having. Now, what's really fascinating about this is while I never learned any of this in school, maybe you didn't either, we are capable of developing these skills. And in another book, a book called Intra-Connected, what I try to do for the larger society is take these lessons of mindsight that we talk about in Now Maps, and then basically say, who is the self? What does connection really mean? Is the self like I'm separate and you're over there and we're two selves are separate? Or is there actually a feeling of subjective experience, perspective, and agency, how you can define a self that's actually broader than just the individual being? It's more a relational self. And now that's a different take, but it allows us to use the Now Maps lessons in young children. And Dean and I did this with Now Maps, and you'll see it in the stories. In Now Maps Junior, we wanted to do, instead of making a Now Maps approach that was like a guidebook and a manual to your own mind as a tween, with Now Maps Junior, what the wonderful group at Pessy and I were able to really work on was how to take those lessons of mindsight and turn them into stories for a child who's in a younger age group than the tweens. So somewhere between 2.5, 3, and maybe 5.5, 6, maybe even going on 7. So, that younger age of preschool, kindergarten, first grade, and then tweens would start, after that. We'll have to see if you take a look at Now Maps, it may be even younger than tweens, 8, 9, 10, but even 6, 7, you may see kids, depending on their development, go into that. And I've even had a 14-year-old use the Now Maps book. It's just coming out, but we have the hard copies, and use that book even in the early teens. So it would be a preceding book to the book for full out adolescence that I wrote called Brainstorm. So Now Maps would be for the tween age roughly, and the preschool, kindergarten, first grade would be the stories that are in the Now Maps Junior book. But all of those stories in that book basically teach about how to pause, how to say, am I okay or not okay? How to look at this Now Maps compass, how to actually take this time and assess where are you at, where what's going on literally right now? How do I really guide myself so that if I'm not doing that in the stories, as you'll see, it can turn out where I can get really irritated with a friend, and if I don't take a pause and reflect on what my irritation is about, that could go really in a not productive way. But if I take the time to take a mindsight moment and pause, things turn out very differently. I can create a much more positive experience. You learn in those stories. So this idea of developing a self that has awareness of what's going on is, part of what I call the new three R's of education. And we've been talking a lot about the first of them, which is reflection, being able to really look at the inner and relational aspect of our self experience, but also look at the inner experience of another individual, and knowing that our self is not just limited by, certainly by the skull, but is much broader. And so, in a way, this is a movement towards not just me, but as we like to say, me plus we is we, this more integrated, intra-connected experience of who we are is what Now Maps Junior and Now Maps provide for kids. But the second of those three R's is the idea of relationships. And in both books, what you see is highlighting that relationships aren't icing on the cake. They're not even the cake. They're the main meal. And I think the pandemic, the viral pandemic, has demonstrated that when we lose those relational connections, we lose our sense of well-being. And what I want to encourage us to do, even right now as we're reflecting on this, is when we think about where are we, who are we, in this relationship of the new three R's, what you do is you realize that in even the individual's brain itself, We are profoundly social. And when you look at what's sometimes called the social brain or the social aspects of the brain or social neuroscience, what you find, in fact, is that while sure, the brain is inside the skull, which is inside the individual body, and you can think, oh, this is a brain of separation. In fact, even from its origins, when the sperm and egg get together and make one cell, and that cell divides into a large group of cells, and that group of cells gets so large in number that some cells in this glob are on the outside, some on the inside. At that moment, soon after that, the outside cells push inward like that. You see where my knuckles are, and then my fingernails. Where the fingernails are becomes a neural tube. So back that up and do it again. The outside cells are going to become the skin, and this layer of the dermis is going to push inward, and that ectoderm now has gone inward to become the nervous system. Well, as we know, the skin is always the interface of the inner and the outer. It's always, determining what's inside, what's outside. Well, the nervous system is the same thing. So it shouldn't be that big a surprise when we think about at least our mammalian history, that it's the nervous system that allows us to live within social groups. And as mammals, as primates, as humans especially, we are incredibly social. And so the viral pandemic has taken the second R of relationship and has really broken them. And so we need to realize that the experience of a full and healthy identity includes the we. It's not just the me, it's the we. And these layers of how we identify and join, we can have different in groups and out groups, and that's a whole another discussion. But the idea is that you can use your mind to overcome any ways where you may feel uncomfortable at first with someone not being like you. We explore this in the different Now Maps books. But then what you do is you rise above that and realize, we can be connected even if we don't like the same cereals or the same sports teams or whatever. So relationships are more than just something that we need to survive. They're actually something that allows us to thrive. So we have reflection abilities that Now Maps teaches. We have the importance of relationships that Now Maps teaches. And then we have the third R, and it's so exciting to share this with you, which is basically called resilience. And in these days, what we have is incredible challenges in the world. And so what we want to think about is how in the world does it unfold that we can build the capacity to take on what's going on in the world if we get into a state of disequilibrium, which, as you know, if you've taken any of the courses or the books or whatever, you know that by calling the mind a self organizing process, we can identify that optimal self organization comes by differentiating and linking, and we name that balance of the two integration. So now what we say is, wow, well, when a system is integrated, it goes through this flow of harmony, and you feel full and vital with five features: flexible, F, adaptive, A, C is coherent, E is energized, and S is stable. That faces flow is what we can define as mental health. So optimal self organization is taking our definition of mind as this fourth facet of self organizing and saying, what does math tell us about complex systems that optimizes self organization? And it's this faces flow that we're going to simply call well being or harmony. Now, interesting, like a river, when you leave that flow of the integrated harmony, you go either to one bank to chaos and the other bank to rigidity. And so part of our OK monitor is to say, am I getting chaotic and rigid, or am I in a state of harmony? And you can have various degrees of being connected that way. And so, what happens interestingly is that you have this way then of looking as I do in the developing mind and these other books about integration. And in now maps, the idea would be when you pause and check in with your okay monitor. How are you doing? Am I okay? Am I not okay? And then you stay within this reflective time and look at what your, basically now maps is doing by taking the focus of attention and aiming it on the different aspects of your map. Now, we call that a focus flashlight. You could call it a focus of attention. The fun thing about writing kids books, and I'm super excited because though I did write a book for adolescents, these are my first books directly written for children, either for children to read themselves in the case of Now Maps with Dina, or for you to read as an adult with a younger child in Now Maps Junior as a set of stories. So it's super exciting because essentially, when you take this focus flashlight and you have your superpowers of this now map to say, basically the wheel of awareness, where are the different energy flows coming at me from outside my body, from inside my body, from my mental life, probably mostly from my head, from my relational worlds. You get, and if you haven't done the wheel of awareness, please go to my website and for free, just try it out for yourself to build your own resilience. But when you integrate like this, when you use your focus flashlight to differentiate the different elements of the now map, because you've pressed your pause button, and now literally you're using your mind to direct energy flow around that map and asking the question, am I integrated and okay? Okay means integrated. Or am I not so okay and moving towards the banks of chaos or rigidity? And that's the okay monitor. You then know you need to do some specific things that we teach you in the books. You need to get yourself back into equilibrium, put a hand on your chest or on your abdomen, and there's all sorts of things. Focus on your breath. In the brainstorm book, you learn a whole series of mindsight skills that we teach also in the Now Maps book. But here, what you're getting is this opportunity to say to a child, you can develop resilience. You can build the skill of responding to something going on and actually not only monitoring it, but modifying it. So these are the lessons of Now Maps, and I'm really excited to have this set of birthdays today. I'm really honored to work with the PESI team. There's Kate Sample and everyone else is so wonderful to work with, and I'm really honored that you've been here today. I see there are some questions coming in. So, what I'm going to do with 20 minutes left is open it up for discussion. And if there aren't that many questions, then I'm happy to keep on talking about stuff. But, Kate, I'm going to ask you to, I can go through it all, but Kate, maybe you're sending them on to me, which I see you're sending me a few. So, let me go read them out loud to you. Here we go. How do you adapt the mindset for neurodivergent, such as autism spectrum disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder children? Thank you, Dorothy. Um, you know, this would be basically exactly the kinds of reflection you'd want to work with, let's say with someone who's on the spectrum, where the key issue would be sensory integration challenges that make for emotion regulation challenges, which make for social cognition challenges, and trying your best to make sure not to flood the individual so that in their sensory integration challenge, you've been too direct. So what I try to do is to teach mindsight skills is to have what's called a joint focus of attention. So instead of the incredibly intense direct eye contact, I'll start by us doing something together. For example, playing dominoes as a young child, and then sharing the emotional resonance that can come from us both being excited about setting them up and they didn't fall down, and then, the social cognition would be to name this is the mindsight moment, or, basically the now map would be talking about a mindsight moment of, in right now, let's map out what we're feeling. I'm so excited it's going to fall, but soon in the future, we're going to push these dominoes down. And so, what you're doing without it being about overwhelming the individual with direct eye contact, saying you need to learn to have eye contact. No, it's this gradual working with sensory integration challenges, so you don't flood them with too much sound or light or tactile sensation, and at the same time you're joining with them so that their emotions are not going to become chaotic or rigid, but instead you're in what I call a window of tolerance, so they stay integrated with communication with you. Then at that key moment, you then do the third part about social cognition. I'll say, I am feeling so much energy in my body. I'm so excited about pushing these dominoes down, you know. And then it's not like about, let's talk about how you got in a fight with your brother yesterday, which is so overwhelming. It's about the dominoes, which is pretty exciting too. And so what I'm building there is the attentional capacity for focusing on social cognitive mapping, these now maps essentially. And if you have someone you're working with there, I'd love to see how the Now Maps Junior and the Now Maps books, the Now Maps, that's called Senior, but it's Now Maps Plain, how those books actually work with kids on the spectrum. I'd love to see that. We haven't tested it, but you'll be the one to give us feedback. For attention deficit disorder, there's a book by Lydia Zalowska, Zylowska, called The Mindful Prescription for ADHD. And in many ways, it was one of our first studies at the UCLA Mindful Awareness Research Center, a pilot study. So it needs a control group and everything like that. But the results were absolutely fascinating. You can actually teach the capacity for focusing attention, which is a mind sight skill, to direct energy flow. And you'll see Lydia Zlowska really talk about the steps for that. So in terms of attention training, absolutely, you can teach these to folks with attentional challenges. And Kate's saying there's a lot of questions on neurodivergence, and that's great. That's fine. And so I just addressed that. Let's see what the next question is. So from I think it's Ildiko Farkas. What if children have significant relational trauma? Yeah. So relationships have historically been dangerous for them. Absolutely, specifically within their families. How can we promote the importance of we for them in a school setting? Yeah, we're just doing a course on that now at the Mindsight Institute, so you might want to hop onto that on disorganized attachment and basically developmental trauma and its relationship to dissociation, and in this case, the extreme of dissociative identity disorder. So we're talking a lot about this, but the idea there is to slowly, work with that child in ways where they feel it's safe to be a we. Now, for kids who've had significant relational trauma, like you're pointing out, a classroom by itself is not going to be enough. They're going to need an individual relationship with a qualified therapist to do that work. And then slowly allowing them to experience the way in which they can be a part of a group without losing their individual identity. So the idea of disorganized attachment and developmental trauma is that they will experience relationships as potentially dangerous, just like you're implying. And so, having a teacher, and there's a book by Patricia Jennings called, I think it's called The Trauma Informed Classroom or something like that, which deals directly with that um, and how to be a part of a we. For teachers, there's a wonderful book by a colleague, Lou Casalino, on, I think it's called The Social Neuroscience of Education, which really looks at the attachment idea, the attachment experience in a classroom. So I would check out those resources too. Thank you. Julia Healy is asking, what book do I recommend to use with teenagers? Brainstorm. Do you have a workbook for teens? It is a workbook. Well, I see the Brainstorm book as a workbook. The gray pages that are embedded in the book are literally a workbook. Um, yeah, so that would be the book I'd recommend. Yeah. So the book Brainstorm is both a book and a workbook in one set of covers. Yeah. So it's both a book and a workbook. Uh, and Jesus is asking, How would I apply the mindset idea when working with a parent and a child at the same time? So now, do you mean working in a dyad? Let me ask Jesus this. Do you mean working like with them together? Because absolutely, this would be, and I've made some suggestions for parent child therapy when you're working with them together. Absolutely, you would be working, teaching mindsight to both child and parent, and you would apply these ideas. You could even, depending on the kid's age, you could do the Now Maps book in the therapy setting and teach those skills of the focus flashlight we were talking about, the pause button, the OK monitor, the Now Map compass, um, and giving child that ability to pause. If you think about it, it's basically entering the hub of the wheel of awareness and giving yourself the space to just be there. Now, interestingly, possibility and hope arise from there, Jesus. So that would be really cool too, to see how that works. So absolutely, you could work on that. Uh, Great. Now the next question is, what is the best way to use the Now Maps books in an outpatient setting? Read it to the patient and do the activities together. I think that would be amazing. For an older kid, you could also have them have their own copy that they would then make sure they're reviewing it. For the younger kids, the Now Maps Junior, you could read it to them together, and unless you had a caregiver who was going to read it with them, you could do the stories and talk about the stories with the younger kid, or read it beforehand and integrate the lesson into the session. I would say both. And since today's the birthday of the book, happy birthday, Now Maps books. And thank you for being here for this. This would be a time, to really check it out yourself, see what works best for you for that particular client, and then let us know, because this is all new, which is great. Eduardo is asking, in DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, we talk about the wise mind, which is the integration of the emotional mind and the reason mind. Is this concept similar to mindsight or different? Well, it's so interesting. I once had the opportunity to teach with Marshall Linehan on stage at an Evolution of Psychotherapy conference, I think it was, and so we actually talked about that as far as I remember. Um, and it's interesting because I asked her about integration, and she didn't say she used the term. So, Eduardo, I'm really fascinated to see you using the word integration. I think that's beautiful, and I would say absolutely. Mindsight is these three things: it's insight, it's empathy, and it's integration. And integration would be realizing that we have both, cognitive processes that can seem somewhat distinct from emotions, but in fact they're really integrated. Sometimes we split them apart when we're really struggling. For example, we're facing a challenge. So, as far as I can tell from talking to Marsha Linehan, it it seems different from what I mean. She was building on mindfulness a lot. I mean, DBT, is a mindfulness based therapy, which is fantastic. Um, and I didn't hear her when I asked her about it talk about mindset, but I don't know DBT as well as you do, or obviously she does. She created it, but she herself said it wasn't integration or mindsight; it was mindfulness. And interestingly, mindfulness, there isn't an absolute agreement on it, but the idea of being aware of what's happening as it's happening, but by itself, while the acceptance can be thought of as differentiating linking, I think it can be that way, but doesn't have to be that way. So I think they're probably very similar. I don't think they're different. I don't think they're in conflict. Let's put it this way. But at least Marsha Linehan didn't think they were the same as far as she thought. Anyway, Connie's asked question: how to work on this interoception mindset with game addicted teens? Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question. I'm not an expert on the treatment of digital addictions, so this is just going to be a clinical guess from a non-expert therapist. But I think it's a really excellent question. For any addiction, what can happen is there's as I'm sure is there's the loop of dopamine secretion in what are sometimes called the reward circuits from a particular kind of activity. In this case, you're talking about game playing. And so, in that sense, from our mind side point of view, it's an impairment to integration because there's excessive differentiation of this one particular activity to the exclusion of other activities, exercising the body, eating well, sleeping well. And so we see it absolutely as an assault on integration. So we would talk about David Rock and I put together this thing called the Healthy Mind Platter. We would talk about making sure the person is able to access other activities, to use the regulatory capacities, the prefrontal capacity, to acknowledge that gaming has become, the addiction of choice, just like it could be a drug or purchasing something or gambling. Gaming can be the same way. And at least in my non expert place, I want to repeat that, what I do is I work with people, and sometimes it works, but, addiction can be very in- ingrained. Sometimes doesn't work, to give them a way of, slowly tapering off of how much they've been using the game, and then to make that combined with more things they do in their life. And, in my clinical practice, which is limited in this area, it has worked well that way. So in that sense, the interoception aspect is to become aware of the distinction inside your body of, do I want this or do I need this? And that confusion can be incredibly important because if you're interpreting a want, I want to play this game, as a need, I need to play this game, then frustrating the need can feel like a life and death thing. I need it, I need it, I need it. But wanting just says, I want it, but I'm choosing not to play the game now. So whether it's with food or sex or drugs or whatever, this is a huge difference. And that's where the interoceptive capacity to feel in the body, that difference between need and want, can be a profound movement. I think there's some really interesting work by Judson Brewer on this, so you might check out Judd Brewer, Brewer, his website on that. So thanks, Connie. Mike Hagan is asking, how do we measure effectiveness of our SEL interventions and progress of our kids without falling into the traps of standardization or making decisions neglecting the unique considerations for the child in our care? Such a great question. I'm actually at a meeting where we're exploring OKRs, which are objectives and key results, which would say you've got to be able to measure something. But in therapy, I'm not sure it applies like that, as you're implying here, Mike. I get worried about implementing SEL in our institutions, which often seem focused on accountability and outcomes. I understand the need for measurement, but I also deeply respect your question about, you know, having a child. Basically, this is what I would try to assess for: is the experience of belonging. Does that child feel like they belong in the classroom? Are they cultivating a sense of curiosity and wonder? Are you keeping their sense of energy alive in the classroom? Do they really want to come to the classroom? How are they interacting with other kids? Is their experience of we, me plus we is we? Do they have this way of feeling into that? And I know the Castle people, and I know they've done a fantastic job measuring social emotional learning. The consortium of academic social emotional learning, and it's been very important to standardize so you can measure things, do statistics. So I would let the measurement be there. I don't think it has to be the be all and end all. So I wouldn't, if someone's saying you got to have it, I wouldn't fight against that. But what I would do is have your own sense of those things of belonging and the connectivity and curiosity that kids feel. Just like, Ken Robinson beautifully talked about, before he passed recently, um, you know, about how we need to keep curiosity alive in our classrooms. And that's hard to measure, but you can feel it. And, with Meta Bowl and Peter Senge, if you go to their website on compassionate systems leadership, you know, we talk about, I work with them, so I say we, but we talk about something called generative social field. And, that's what that would include the feeling of social emotional learning, but it would be this generativity. We don't know exactly how to measure it. We put a lot of energy into how do you measure a generative relational field. I think it has to do with integration myself. So that's just a guess. But that's a great question, Mike. Thanks. Marie is asking, the children I work with tend to want to play games more than talk about the issues at hand. And sometimes that's fine. Sometimes they actually can work through things. Play therapy is really an important way of sometimes getting to the deeper implicit stuff than actually talking. So that isn't necessarily, I think, a problem unless they're avoiding something and playing games that have nothing to do with their issues. So it really depends, Maria, on what is it, an avoidance really, or is it just that as adults we like to talk about things, but kids work things out implicitly through games? What is the best way to engage them when they prefer not to discuss the problem areas? Depending on the age of the kid, like a young kid, I remember when I was a very active child therapist. I mean, I had a lot of really, really young kids, and games were their way of talking, and it was really, with the scenarios that would come up, problems would come up in the games. And so, for younger kids, the games were their way of really communicating. Let's use that word, communicating about the issues. And we worked it out with it. We like the kid with the dominoes I was talking about. Older kids, sure. I mean, having a more abstract way of saying this feeling of anger makes you break through your window of tolerance. Not to use that term, but makes you get really upset. So let's work with your anger, and then working with that directly. Yeah, sometimes you absolutely need to name that, but sometimes things are just too upsetting. So Marie, what I would say is, you know, um, even mentioning, it's hard to talk about it if you don't feel comfortable when you're teaching these mindset skills. And the Now Maps book would be a really interesting book to read, the book with that child who doesn't want to talk about things, but have what's called this joint attention, where you're reading Now Maps or Now Maps Junior and using that as a common focus of attention, and that would actually guide you to some very therapeutic conversations. So I would try that. That's what I would recommend, Marie. And then there's one more question, I think. Yeah, and we have time for the last question from Trish. This is so good. Uh, Here we go. Let's see. Fantastic. Let's see. It says, I love this presentation. Oh, thank you. Thanks, Trish. And appreciate that it was aimed at children and teens. Yes. I'm working with a number of adults, absolutely, who also need to learn this content. Okay, great. Yes. So is the Now Maps appropriate for them? Well, I'd love to say, because it's the birthday of Now Maps, use it for them. And at the same time, if they're still in their adolescence, which goes the mid late 20s, Brainstorm is great. And the other book, Mindsight, would be a great book. Is there another resource book that could be used to work with them? And I'm just, there are other projects I'm working on that will probably be very relevant for adults. So, you know, Dina Margolin and I wrote Now Maps, with a a child, meaning, this tweenish age, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, maybe 13, 14, with them in mind. An adult might find it just too basic. And so the Brainstorm would probably be better. The gray page is a Brainstorm, but all that stuff you'd see in Mindsight, that book. So, um, that's how I would leave it. Say, look at those other resources for adults. But if you do use Now Maps for adults and you find it's useful, I'd love to know. That would be amazing. So I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Kate Sample for directing us in such a wonderful way. I want to thank Maddie for being here. I'd like to thank Dina Margolin, my wonderful co-author, for Now Maps. And I want to thank the whole PESI team, and I want to thank all of you for the important work you're doing for the youth of the world. And please come join us in any of the PESI's times or any of our Mindsight Institute times. Come check out the different courses we have. Now Maps can be used in all sorts of ways in schools, at home, in therapy. Please email us at admin@mindsightinstitute.com and let us know how Now Maps is going for you. Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure to be here with you, and I wish you all the best. Happy birthday now, Maps.